Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Zishen Li, and I'm on the National Climate Assessment Team here at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I'd like to draw your attention to the note in the chat box. Microphones today are disabled for all participants, but if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them in the chat. For that reason, the raise hand button will not be useful today. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact my colleague, Izzy Fuller, who is our technical support person today. She will be monitoring the chat. Please also note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards others per USGCRP's Code of Conduct. Next slide, please. So today I'll kick off the webinar with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to the indicator's appendix authors. Next one, please. The U.S. Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to, quote, assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change, unquote. The program convenes 15 agencies to advance climate and global change science to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. Next slide, please. The same law that establishes the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment known here as the National Climate Assessment, or NCA. The NCA is a quadrennial report that analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors: the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. USGCRP is charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The NCA is used by organizations and individuals for multiple purposes, including national policymaking, risk assessment in the private sector, local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, and educators. Next slide, please. NCA authors review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. They synthesize that information, examine the confidence in our scientific understanding, and then evaluate the uncertainties. NCA5 was written by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant. Authors distill their findings into accessible language framed around risks to help people with important resources. That being said, this report is strictly not policy prescriptive. We do not advocate for particular viewpoints or policy measures in the report. The NCA uses a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios. Afterwards, it leaves it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their risk threshold. The assessment here is compliant with applicable federal laws and policies, including the Global Change Research Act. Oh, thank you. Can we go back to slide number 5? Thanks. The assessment is compliant with applicable federal laws and policies, including the Global Change Research Act, as well as other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, and transparency. Finally, this report process involves extensive reviews, including several opportunities for public engagement, a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or NACM, and several government science reviews. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, let's have a chance to take a look at the NCA5 table of contents. Just like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers several national level topics, followed by regions, and then response actions. The report opens with an overview chapter, which is followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical sciences of climate change. Then we'll open up to several national topic chapters, the 10 regional chapters, and last but not least, 2 response chapters, although the response actions are also discussed throughout the report. The NCA table of contents has also evolved over time, which is informed by user input throughout the process. NCA5 added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. We also have 5 new focus features here, which are compound extreme events, Western wildfires, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. Last but not least, we also have several appendices, including a new one, brand new one dedicated to indicators, which we will present today. Now, we have gone through some introductory background. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mike Collian and Laura Stevens, who have been the leaders of the Indicators Appendix. They will lead us through the remainder of the webinars today, along with several panelists. Thank you so much, and please take it away, Laura.
Thank you, Yishan, and thanks for everyone for joining us today. It's absolutely great to see so many people on the webinar. My name is Laura Stevens. I'm a research scientist with North Carolina State University, and I'm the non-federal chapter lead for the Indicators Appendix. I'm also joined today by the federal lead, Mike Collian, who was with EPA when we started this process, and now he's with the Department of Energy. And then a few of our authors and technical contributors are on the line for the Q&A session at the end. So we've only got so much time, so we're going to jump right in and talk about what an indicator actually is. Well, in the context of climate science, an indicator is any kind of observation or calculation, basically any kind of metric that you can measure and track over time. And in the context of the National Climate Assessment, we just look at observations, and we're not talking about scenarios or projections of the future when we discuss indicators. Indicators are often presented as figures, so maps or charts like the one shown here. This is a pretty straightforward representation of an indicator. This is a simple time series of the change in sea level in the Northeast United States. If you want to look at this particular indicator in more detail, you can dive into the Indicators Appendix. That's one of our figures there. To read the appendix, just go to the NCA5 website and navigate to Appendix 4. And while you're there, make sure to also check out this wonderful piece of artwork that is associated with our chapter called Rivers Feed the Trees. As Yishen pointed out at the beginning, this is the first time a section of the National Climate Assessment has been solely dedicated to indicators, which is fantastic. And I'm going to pass it off to Mike to talk about the Indicators Appendix and why it's important.
All right. Thank you, Laura. Mike Collian here from Department of Energy. So I'm just going to go through a little bit about some more about the importance of indicators and why the Appendix 4 and sort of housing indicators to serve the purposes of the NCA5 more generally. So indicators, really a foundational piece of information on global change. We're trying to capture observed change. As Laura pointed out, these are not projections, but observed change. There's a mixture of human-induced and natural influences to these changes, and we're not set out to really quantify those factors, but rather, every indicator that appears in the appendix and that we would call an indicator has a relationship to climate. They really allow us to cross-connect the report's various sectors, chapters, and the regional chapters. And so you'll see indicators throughout the report. And we do a lot of cross-linking. I think the last time I checked the overview, there was like 17 or so references to the appendix for the indicators and in support of the overview and some of the science that's found in the report. Indicators are not static. They are tracking changes, but we also want to track them and update them routinely with data. So that's a nice evergreen way to supply information in the interim of these large climate assessments that take sometimes 4 or 5 years to generate. The indicators help us support decision-making and communication, a really, really strong emphasis on that, because they are distilling often a large body of science into a single graph or chart, as Laura had mentioned. Some high-level themes to point out real quickly. Observed changes are occurring everywhere. They're documented across the US, and nearly there are no boundaries for some of the changes that we do see. And they're very cross-cutting and cross-disciplinary. And so we have a wide array of topics covered just in the appendix, but also there is a lot of coverage throughout the regional chapters and sector chapters. It serves to advance the science. We had a lot of emerging indicators in the works, and so this appendix served as a driver to get them to the finish line and to feature some of those indicators. So that was exciting. And we've come to learn that there are different types of indicators. There are the usual suspects like sea level rise, Arctic sea ice, temperature, things that you would normally think of, but there are other kinds of indicators that we're interested in tracking that are really necessary for telling the fuller story of impacts to human health, and or getting into mitigation and tracking adaptation measures and bringing in societal considerations. And so we talk a little bit about that. This is also talked about elsewhere in the report, and we linked to those areas as well. An emerging area of research and ongoing science there. Indicators are grouped into 6 categories, which we'll walk through and provide some examples of an indicator in each of those categories. All right, so this here is a view of a figure in the report, and it's really meant to sort of highlight, hey, USGCRP has taken on indicators, considering it a sustained assessment activity. And there is an interagency work group that's been formed that collaborates across the federal agencies on advancing indicators, using it to support some of the research and science that's out there. There's a website that USGCRP hosts that's dedicated to indicators. There's a few indicators that are hosted there, as well as it points out to agency efforts that are linked to serving indicators. So a lot of information there. There's a community, and it's not just the interagency work group on indicators, but we tap into other work groups and other communities that are associated with USGCRP. So a little bit about how we reached out and coordinated across the report. So this is a figure, this is adapted from a figure in the appendix, in which we are featuring the 3 most important observed changes in each region. So we worked with the regional chapter leads. They were formulating some of their key messages, and these were some of the top 3 observed changes that they were speaking about in their chapters. And we can show those. Each one of these, nearly every one of these, can be supported by an indicator. Some of them are featured in the appendix. If they're not featured somewhere in the report, they are well supported by the science and peer-reviewed literature that these impacts are happening in these regions. And so this was just a really neat way to sort of tie into the various parts of the report and sort of map it out. These 2, as you'll notice, are sort of, again, some of the usual suspects, but we'll get into some of the other changes that are occurring in the US. Here's just another to kind of stay on geographical scales and differences. Here's just a view of temperature change, and we're looking at 4 different metrics of temperature change: global annual mean temperature, and then US temperature change, nighttime minimum temperature, And then we're in the bottom left, we're looking at changes in cooling degree days for the Southwest. And in the bottom right, we're looking at extremely hot days, so days over 110 degrees. And so the neat thing about this is we can show different metrics at different scales. All of these are sort of comparing the last 30-year period of temperature change to an earlier period and showing the magnitude of change. And so the warming isn't uniform. It's there's a lot of variability, but overall, each of these is showing and expressing increases in temperature. People use these for various reasons and for various uses, and we try to put some information about how stakeholders may be interested in these various indicators. So next, I'll turn it back to Laura.
Thanks, Mike. So yeah, we're going to briefly walk through the main sections of the indicators appendix, starting with atmospheric indicators. I'll just note that the figures we're presenting here today are great examples of indicators, but there are, of course, many more indicators throughout NCA5 and elsewhere that demonstrate how our climate is changing. Both globally and across the US, temperatures are rising as a result of increasing greenhouse gases, as we know, and are primarily caused by human activities. This, of course, leads to increases in extreme events and impacts. And I'd encourage you to check out the other NCA5 chapters and the other webinars to learn more about the impacts of climate change across the different regions, as well as the societal and economic sectors. So in order to assess trends, impacts, and climate risks, we first need to look at these atmospheric indicators. There are, of course, many different components of our atmosphere that we can measure and track, including these examples: greenhouse gases, temperature, precipitation, and extreme events. Next slide, please. So the first indicator we're featuring here today is the Annual Greenhouse Gas Index, or AGGI. Greenhouse gas emissions are the primary driver of climate change, and AGGI is a really useful indicator showing how the cumulative warming effects of CO2, methane, and other long-lived greenhouse gases has been increasing over time. The AGGI compares the total radiative forcing each year, so that's the annual amount of energy from the sun that's trapped by Earth's atmosphere, compares that to the year 1990, which was when the Montreal Protocol was signed. As this indicator shows, increases in this radiative forcing lead to the warming of our planet, and the average warming of those long-lived greenhouse gases has increased 49% since 1990. Next slide, please. The next indicator I'm going to highlight is urban heat island intensity. This is one that was developed by our colleagues at USGS. We know that the same amount of warming is not happening everywhere. Mike already mentioned that. And urban areas experience higher temperatures than the surrounding landscapes because many structures, such as roads and buildings, absorb and radiate heat, and that exacerbates the effects of the increasing temperatures. This figure shows the urban heat island intensity, which is essentially the difference in the temperature between the urban area and the surrounding non-urban area for 3 different US cities. The data are presented as maps for the year 2020 on the top row and as time series from 1985 to 2020 on the bottom row. Indicators such as these can be used to help inform heat-related adaptation and mitigation strategies, such as adding urban vegetation cover, as one example. Next, please. As Mike mentioned earlier, this appendix exists to support and tie in with the other NCA5 chapters, and this indicator demonstrates that really nicely, as it's actually a companion figure to figure 12.6 in the Built Environment, Urban Systems and Cities chapter. Their figure, shown here, shows the relationship between land surface temperature and median household income for the same 3 cities and demonstrates how lower income neighborhoods often experience higher temperatures. Since NCA5 was published, these data have actually been made available for 50 different US cities. So you can check that out at sciencebase.gov if you're interested. Just type UHI in the search bar on that website and data should come up. Next slide, please. Another indicator which really demonstrates the impacts of our changing climate is billion-dollar disasters. This indicator comes from NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. And the figure here shows the number of disasters occurring each year in the US that exceed $1 billion in damages, and they're categorized by disaster type. We can see that the number of these events has increased dramatically since 1980, And there's another figure in NCA5, figure 1.7, that breaks down the amount of damages by state over the past 5 years. So that's a really interesting one to look at too. Extreme event indicators such as these allow communities to evaluate changes in risk, as major weather and climate disasters can threaten lives, damage property, and affect our daily activities. Next, please. So that was a really brief look at some of our atmospheric indicators. And now we'll take a look at ice, snow, and water indicators. Again, there are so many indicators that we could look at here, but the appendix focuses mainly on metrics related to Arctic sea ice, snowpack, flooding, and drought. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to show 2 of these, the first being snowpack. Next slide, please. Snowpack in the Western US is really important in terms of water supply, and warming temperatures are causing snow to melt earlier, which affects both the timing and the availability of water in that region. This can also lead to impacts on recreation, tourism, and ecosystems, for example. The 3 figures here show changes in the amount and timing of snowpack in the Western US, as well as the length of the snowpack season. We see a lot of red colors in these maps, which indicate a decrease in snowpack amount, an earlier peak in regards to the timing of snowpack, and a shorter snowpack season length. And these data, by the way, come from EPA. Next, please. The next indicator is one that I really like. This one comes from the USDA Forest Service and is one of our newest indicators to be developed. The maps here show trends in both flood frequency on the right and flood magnitude on the left for areas west of the Mississippi River. It can be seen here that trends vary widely across the US, but it's really important to be able to quantify such trends within the regional watersheds in order to aid with floodplain management and infrastructure design. So that, again, was a really quick look at ice, snow, and water indicators. I'm now going to pass it back to Mike to give some examples from the next 2 sections of the appendix.
All right, thank you, Laura. So oceans and coasts. This is a tandem that you'll find elsewhere in the NCA5. There is an oceans chapter and a coastal effects chapter. But here we've just gathered a few sea level rise and then coastal flooding, a nice pairing there. First order consequence of sea level rise is coastal flooding, and there's a lot of information about that and interest in that. Marine heat waves and marine species, and we'll go through examples of these. So marine heat waves comes up, and this is something that the science is really underscored. There was a IPCC Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change report in 2019 that highlighted marine heat waves as occurring with high confidence globally, and a lot more data has become available to generate indicators. But what is a heat wave? A marine heat wave, it is an event of anomalously warm temperatures lasting 5 or more days. And in this case, where temperatures exceed the 90th percentile against a 30-year historic average. And so this is a period of warm water that persists. It is associated with a lot of socioeconomic and ecological impacts for those that last long and are fairly severe. And so there is a way to express and calculate this. And we chose to kind of profile this indicator sort of to show it's the sum of its parts and some of the team of scientists that came together to develop this for the appendix. So the geographic scale here, we're looking at large marine ecosystems in this case. And so each of those big numbered blobs are large marine ecosystems. The period of record here is 1982 to present. The baseline period that we're comparing this threshold in 90th percentile to is in 1982, so 2001. The data source for this information is coming from NOAA's gridded temperature data set. And this allows us to pixel by pixel calculate these thresholds and develop these interpolated maps. And you can choose different regions. You could be interested in the economic exclusive zone, which is sort of along the coasts, and very important for US fisheries. There are other, you could look at marine protected areas. You could look at various areas of interest. The resolution here is daily. And again, this is a gridded data set that's nearly global. Some of the related indicators that are associated with marine heat waves are trends in sea surface temperature, marine species distribution, which we'll take a look at in a moment, coral health. There is a lot of thermal stress, heating degree days that are associated with corals. And so, yeah, there's some other great information in the report about marine heat waves in chapter 21. There is a figure that outlines what's happening in the Gulf of Maine. And there's also a really chronological important figure in chapter 10 that outlines the marine heat wave from 2014 to 2016, which led to a lot of ecological and societal impacts. So encourage you to take a look at that. And that is marine heat waves. This little bonus figure for you is that figure from 21.4 that shows sea surface temperatures that average in the black line there. And you can see how that has increased in the later part of the time period here. And the red markings below are days that have exceeded the threshold for marine heat wave. And so you can see the association between elevated average temperatures, which rises some of your extremes, to days in which you're having heat waves. Another little element to point out here too is if we look at that 30-year base period, which is 82 to 2011 on this graph, that's that average that's pretty that's a little bit below where the recent values are. And if we're looking at the record going forward, you can see where you might have a marine heat wave every day if you're comparing against that average from the earlier period. So it matters what baseline period you choose. It's just something to point out in some of our indicator work. All right, so another indicator that we have featured in the appendix is marine species distribution. This data too comes from NOAA. There are marine fishing trawls that are out into these various regions collecting data on the center of abundance of various species. And you can track those locations. And this is showing the annual change in latitude and depth for populations of species in these various regions. So elevated species are very sensitive to these environmental cues and temperature changes. And so we see a lot of distribution changes, especially to those species that are important for fisheries. And I think that covers that. And I think I'm covering land ecosystem indicators as well. So this is the next section in the appendix where we're covering some seasonal changes and some more ecological changes, as well as wildfire and agriculture and food systems. So here, one way to cover a lot of ground is to look at changes in seasonality. Every one of the lines here in this chart is actually a specific indicator. So lake ice is thawing earlier and freezing later, expanding that window. Spring snow melt, as Laura touched upon earlier, is happening a little bit earlier. Alaska river ice, Arctic sea ice melt season is increasing over time. Wildfire season across the West since the early 80s has increased 10 to 15 weeks. Leaf and bloom dates, a lot of vernal activity is happening earlier as we track these. These are happening across the U.S. in very specific locations in some cases, like cherry blossoms in Washington, D.C. Tracking that date for over 100 years we've seen the bloom date occur 6 days earlier. So a lot can be gleaned from looking at these changes in seasonality and shifting in the timing and seasonal, like heat wave season from start to finish is growing longer. So a lot can be observed both from land and ecosystem and terrestrial based indicators. Next, we turn to wildfires and an indicator that sort of brings together a climate hazard and some social dimensions. And so this was wildfires in the wildland-urban interface, and how changes and trends in these two things are converging to increase risk and potential exposure to populations. So in the upper left, you have the trend in wildfire activity here, the size and acres burned and over time. And you can see how that's changed and how more acres are burning over time. This is largely happening in the West. We have the wildland-urban interface, which is an area where there is developed land next to burnable land, or interfacing or intermixing with burnable land. And so it's a particularly vulnerable area where we have growth in that area, and therefore more development, more population, more risk of life and property damage in those areas. So we can combine those two to see where in the US, which counties this is being highlighted the most, where there's the most growth in the wildland-urban interface and the percent of county burned. And I'm going to turn it back to Laura.
Thanks, Mike. I especially like the in-depth look of one of those indicators there that really helps folks understand how we develop these indicators. But I'm going to finish up with the last two sections, which are health and adaptation and mitigation. And these are both still somewhat emerging areas of research in terms of climate indicators. Health indicators such as heat-related illnesses and deaths are mentioned in NCA5, but it's also important to note that health indicators include more than just measures of health outcomes in order to understand how climate impacts and exposures influence health burdens. There are, however, some challenges with collecting and reporting health data, including lag times and availability, and that can make it more challenging to develop indicators. Next slide. One indicator that we do have in the appendix, though, is this figure showing the annual incidence rates of 3 infectious diseases that are influenced by climate change: West Nile virus, Lyme disease, and vibriosis. Although these are affected by other environmental and social factors, indicators like this can provide a general gauge of the disease burden and help guide resources and public health actions. And next slide, please. And finally, we have the indicators of adaptation and mitigation. Adaptation to promote climate resilience, as well as mitigation to reduce emissions, are really critical, particularly for protecting human well-being and the environment. You can, of course, learn about these efforts in the adaptation and mitigation chapters of NCA5. But in terms of indicators specifically, indicators of adaptation and mitigation are really important tools that can help us track and assess progress, as well as evaluate adaptation decisions and improve resilience. Next slide, please. A lot of adaptation and mitigation indicators are still being envisioned and developed, but one example is this indicator, which looks at how energy production has been changing over time. This is broken down into total primary energy on the left, so that's fossil fuels and renewable energy, and just renewables on the right. We can see that US energy production from renewables is increasing, which is encouraging, particularly due to increases in wind and biomass energy in recent years. So again, that was a really brief look at those sections, and I'll pass things back to Mike to conclude this presentation. You're still muted, Mike.
There we go. Sorry about that. And so appreciate that, Laura. And that really hits on the need for bringing together different types of indicators and different data sets to pick up some of these responses and mitigation adaptation actions. But continued advancement and research are really necessary to continue the development of those indicators that combine social dimensions and climate data. And we see this really taking off in the area of vulnerability and risk. There's a lot of development of vulnerability indices, but it doesn't have to be an index per se, but bringing together these trends that are inextricably linked. And if we really want to understand risk, who's at risk, and where things are happening, we need to bring these data sets together and the trends together. There is a lot of focus now on underserved EJ communities, tribal and indigenous lands, and so this can easily be done to incorporate these disproportionate impacts. So the other thing is just increase and sustain the existing observational data sets. So we work pretty closely with, or at least the interagency work group works really closely with an observational work group, and keeping these observations alive, keeping the data sets coming, keeping alive the ability to update these on an ongoing basis. This really needs to happen. Without this information, we can't quantify, we can't characterize all of these changes that we'd like to. Opportunities exist for continuing and really transitioning towards tracking adaptation actions, and some good work has been done and is highlighted in chapter 32 in the adaptation response chapter. There is a lot of community resilience type indicators that really identify and try to point out where capacity is lacking, where capacity is okay, where we need some strategic action. Climate and mitigation goals, I mean, these, if it is pointed out, unequivocal that greenhouse gases are driving a lot of these observed changes, we ought to be looking at our mitigation goals to reduce those greenhouse gases. And so there's a lot of indicators to bring together that would tell that side of the story. Indicators drawing from indigenous knowledge, even community, citizen science. These are all data sets and pathways that we need to explore and continue to explore to add and surround for context. Broader engagement, I don't think any of us really thinks we do this in the federal vacuum, but rather this involves scientists from all over. This involves community members, stakeholders, and others to engage on what is a useful indicator and where to head. And so I think it's just a place of active research and exploration, and we sort of end the chapter on that note. And I think here's a quick look at the chapter team, and I think we turn it back over to the host.